Welcome back to Tidbits, everybody. Episode number 9 today. And recently, I don't know about you all, but I've been feeling some pretty serious cabin fever. And I don't know if it's a year of COVID isolation or how close spring feels lately. But I've decided that today I wanted to cover a subject that was extra meaningful to me. And not to say that these aren't all really important episodes that I've been doing, but today I wanted to do one that's a little bit more fun for me. So, in the spirit of sharing too much over the internet, let's talk about my obsession with ancient Egypt. Like probably a lot of other people out there, I fell in love with the idea of ancient Egypt in about 8th grade or so. I did a book report in my 8th grade English class on a nonfiction book called The Wonders of Egypt. I carried this book around with me all the time, and I told anyone who would listen to me that I was going to be an Egyptologist one day. I don't actually think my parents thought that was a real job, like they thought I made up the word. I didn't. It's a real job. Obviously that didn't happen, but for a kid obsessed with fantasy books and faraway lands, ancient Egypt seemed so cool. Enter 1999's The Mummy, featuring Rachel Weisz and Brendan Fraser. Come on, of course I was hooked. In college, my art history professor introduced Egyptian art as the one that all his students come in already being obsessed with. But he cautioned us that Hollywood history is not to be trusted. We then spent the next several weeks poring over several thousand years worth of statues, inscriptions, tomb paintings, jewelry, tombs, pyramids, chariots, and more, the most benign things. He kind of wanted to remind us that ancient Egypt is not a faraway fantasy land. It's real. It was a real place, a real culture with rich history, and Hollywood's embellishments are not doing it any favors. So, today I am going to give you the world's fastest rundown of 3,500 years of history and go over 4 specific pharaohs and a few works of art in here, and just share this common geek out with you that I really enjoy reading about. So, without further ado, let's get started. First up, a couple of vocab terms that I definitely forgot to do in my intro video. Number 1 is dynasty. This is defined as a continuous rule by members of the same family. When you look at timelines of ancient Egypt, it's often broken down into dynasties. Egyptians did not measure time from a fixed point, like what year is 2021. They measured it in lengths of rule, and the clock restarted every time a new ruler took power. Up next is Upper and Lower Egypt. This can get tricky because Upper Egypt is geographically south of Lower Egypt. This has to do with following the direction of the Nile, which unusually flows from south to north. So Upper Egypt means the Upper Nile, but southern geographically. Last vocab term is sunken relief. This is an art form in which the artist carves an image into the stone, rather than cutting away the background, like raised relief. Sunken relief is the most common form of sculpture in ancient Egypt. When we say ancient Egyptian art, it includes painting, sculpture, architecture, and other forms of art, such as drawings on papyrus, created between 3000 BCE and 100 CE. Most of this art was highly stylized and symbolic. Much of the surviving forms come from tombs and monuments, and thus have a focus on life after death and preservation of knowledge. We rarely know the name of the artist who makes these works of art. That is because their work was all functional. It served a discrete purpose. For example, a statue was meant to hold the spirit of the god or the deceased. A tomb painting showed scenes from one's life on Earth, so one's spirit could remember it. Art for art's sake was unknown and would have probably been incomprehensible to an ancient Egyptian who understood art as functional above all else. This is not to say, however, that the Egyptians had no sense of aesthetic beauty. Even today, Egyptian art is consistently admired for its beauty, but it all had a very specific context and purpose in mind. Take, for example, the Palette of Narmer. The Narmer palette, circa 3150 BCE, is a two-sided ceremonial plate of siltstone, intricately carved with scenes of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by King Narmer. It is perhaps the world's oldest historical document. The unknown artist carved Narmer at least 2 times bigger than any other figure in the piece, a practice known as hierarchical scale. This means that the more important a subject is, the bigger they are in the artwork. Note the perfect symmetry on both sides of the piece, whether in the cow's head on top, symbol of Hathor, known as Mother of the Pharaohs, or the twisted lionesses being restrained by the pharaoh's men. The smaller figures denote their lesser rank compared to King Narmer. Once it was established in the Old Kingdom, ancient Egyptian art style did not change much at all. Notice how in this piece the pharaoh is shown in partial profile. In 3,000 years of Egyptian art, the pharaoh never changes his pose. The legs are always shown in profile, with the left foot planted in front of the right. The chest and shoulders are in frontal view, while the face is in profile. All artists of the time followed a canon of proportions, a set of predetermined rules and ratios for representing the human figure. During most of Egyptian history, the human figure's size was related to the width of the palm of the artist's hand. The entire figure, from feet to hairline, is 18 palms high. The top of the head was not included because of the variety of headdresses and crowns. This is why Egyptian royals all seem to look alike. The pharaoh was considered perfect and unchanging, just like a god. Therefore, his proportions had to be unchanging in art. You'll have to forgive me for this, but I am about to skip over the Great Pyramids entirely. There is a ton of great information out there if you want to learn more about their history and creation, and I'd rather use this time to widen our gaze a little bit. Let's fast forward 1.5 thousand years to the New Kingdom, started after Egypt, made up of several small fractured states, had been invaded by a neighboring people. Ahmose I, however, was a pharaoh who rose up to unify the empire and even expand it into Nubia and Libya. During this golden age of Egyptian expansion, however, grave robbing became a lucrative business, and pharaohs worried they would not survive the afterlife with their riches intact. The rise of grave robbing ushered in the time of the Valley of the Kings. Pharaohs were no longer being buried in elaborate tombs that practically said, "Come rob me," with a neon sign, but instead were buried in nondescript rock-hewn tombs on the west bank of the Nile. The 18th dynasty is when we see the god queen Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt from 1473 to 1458 BCE. Her rise to power was noteworthy, as it required her to utilize her bloodline, education, and an understanding of religion. She is generally regarded by Egyptologists as one of the most successful pharaohs of all time, reigning longer than any other woman of an indigenous Egyptian dynasty. According to Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, she is also known as the first great woman in history of whom we are informed. Under her 21-year-long reign, Hatshepsut cultivated peace instead of war. She developed lucrative trade routes and was known as a prolific builder. Arguably, her buildings were grander and more numerous than those of her Middle Kingdom predecessors. Later pharaohs even attempted to claim some of her projects as their own. Hatshepsut was addressed as His Majesty and commissioned male-like images of herself, such as the Sphinx in the Met in New York City. By most counts, Egypt only had 4 queens in its entire 3,000-year history. Perhaps this was part of looking the part to bolster support from her people. Not all future pharaohs were so willing to follow in her very successful footsteps, however. An attempt was made to remove Hatshepsut from certain historical and pharaonic records. The elimination was carried out in the most literal way possible. Her cartouches and images were chiseled off of stone walls, leaving very obvious Hatshepsut-shaped gaps in the artwork. The erasures were sporadic and haphazard, however, with only the more visible and accessible images of her being removed. Had it been more complete, we would not now have so many images or records of her rule. 2 pharaohs later enter Amenhotep of the 18th dynasty. He launched a new monotheistic religion in Egypt, built around the sun god Aten. Saying he rocked the proverbial Egyptian boat would be an understatement. He started out by changing his name to Akhenaten, meaning it pleases Aten. He moved the entire capital away from Thebes, where the previous god's temples were plentiful and powerful, to a new city called Akhenaten, known today as Amarna. This also ushered in the first major change to Egyptian art style in thousands of years. Honesty was of central importance in this new religion, so artists had to depict people, pharaohs included, more truthfully. This included everyday situations like sitting with your family, and even blemishes and imperfections, like this hitherto unforeseen, pot-bellied god king. One of the best examples of what is now called Amarna-style art is this family portrait. It features Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, yes, that Nefertiti, and their 3 young daughters. The youngest princess, still an infant, plays with her mother's earring. Akhenaten tousles the hair of one princess in his arms while she points to the Ankh, a symbol of life, at the tip of a sun ray. The other princess holds Nefertiti's hand and points towards their father. Intimacy between parents and children was new in Egyptian art, and this would have been considered quite shocking to see at the time. Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment did not take root. In fact, it died with him. The next pharaoh to take over immediately reinstated the old religion and moved the capital back to Thebes. Who was this new ruler? Well, he's a certain 9-year-old boy with a very famous burial mask, Tutankhamun, aka a young King Tut. And with that, I conclude my whirlwind tour through several thousand years of Egyptian history. Thank you for sticking it out through all of that with me. I do hope to return to ancient Egypt and ancient art in another future episode and maybe dive a little deeper into a specific piece, because there's so much material to cover, obviously, that I didn't do in this one. So stay tuned, and thanks so much for watching.